Greetings and welcome back to room 303, the Harvard Classic Lectures. This is lecture number 89. We are now going to turn in Harvard Classics Lectures volume 25 to Thomas Carlyle, the great prose stylist. Now, we're in the same volume as John Stuart Mill, and Carlyle and Mill had a relationship, which is probably why Eliot decided to put these two together. Carlyle is not as well known today as somebody like John Stuart Mill, and he does have some problems with his political views. He has some racist views that are products of his own cultural time. But we're going to look at three of his offerings in the Harvard Classics. We'll actually analyze two of the three. His characteristics from 1831, his famous Inaugural Address at Edinburgh, his classic on how you should read and why you should read from the 2nd of April, 1866. We're not going to touch as much his essay on Sir Walter Scott from the 1838 offering. This is his great famous view, an elongated view of his notion of the importance of the great man theory. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. To some degree, we're going to look at Carlyle, though, as a great influence of American thought, especially through his time with Ralph Waldo Emerson. Go back and take a look at learnstrong.net at my Emerson lectures in the Harvard Classics, and you'll hear that I mentioned a number of times the influence of Thomas Carlyle. Let's do some real quick biography. He is born in Scotland in December of 1795. One of my favorite stories about Carlyle is that in 1809, at roughly the age of 14, he walked all the way to Edinburgh, 100 miles, to go to university. Take that one, right? Okay, so he is a great translator of Goethe and other German writers, very much influenced Emerson and the Transcendentalists in America. He was a friend of John Stuart Mill as well. His famous text is, among others, Heroes and Hero Worship, where he made the argument that when you look at history, one way to read history is the great men theory. Now, of course, today we would look at this and say, wait a minute, because there's great women heroes. We think of Rosa Parks immediately, don't we? But in his view, he argued that these great men are what drive history. Napoleon comes to mind, Alexander the Great comes to mind, and it became a very popular view in the late 19th century, early 20th century. Obviously, it's not a view that we hold much to today, but I think some of what Carlyle has to say about influences and great leaders and great individuals, probably we still can hold some value with that idea. He was always an outsider. He was unpleasant. He was gruff. His wife was also equally known to be that way. He does lose his wife, and after that fact, he becomes a broken man and then quickly will pass away himself. Let's turn now to the first of two essays that I want to take a look at just briefly. I want to give you a sense of Carlyle's prose. And obviously, as we have said in many of these lectures, my hope is that then you'll be attracted to maybe want to read some of Carlyle on your own. His opening lines of characteristics, his essay from 1831, published in the Edinburgh Review. He says it this way: "The healthy know not of their health, but only the sick. This is the physician's aphorism, and applicable in far wider sense than he gives it. We may say it holds no less in moral, intellectual, political, poetical, than in merely corporal therapeutics, that wherever or in what shape soever, powers of the sort which can be named vital are at work. Herein lies the test of their working right or working wrong." The argument being, in other words, that we take for granted our health until, of course, we don't have our health. It's then that we understand it. We'll think, of course, of Emily Dickinson's classic, "Success is counted sweetest for those who ne'er succeed. To comprehend a nectar requires sorest need." I've given a full lecture on that poem, but the idea is that we never really understand what we have until it is leaving us. This will be true for Carlyle in his assessment of, for example, society and the effectiveness of society vis-a-vis its moral standing. He will talk about inquiry and disease this way. He'll say it this way: "The beginning of inquiry is dis-ease. all science, if we consider well, as it must have originated in the feeling of something being wrong, so it is and continues to be but division, dismemberment, and partial healing of the wrong. Thus, as was of old written, the tree of knowledge springs from a root of evil and bears fruits of good and evil. Had Adam remained in paradise, there had been no anatomy and no metaphysics. It's an interesting idea that, of course, as we studied in our John Milton study with Paradise Lost, you can go back and look at those lectures, this notion that it was a certain kind of desire for something that was lacking. Of course, that's an irony given that we're in an Eden garden where everything is supposed to be perfect. Back to the Emily Dickinson observation of success is counted sweetest by those who ne'er succeed. He says it this way: to say that we have a clear conscience is to utter a solecism. Had we never sinned, we should have had no conscience. Where defeat unknown, neither would victory be celebrated by songs of triumph. The Taoist yin-yang symbol comes to mind as well, doesn't it? To talk a little bit about society and the very idea that we have a society at all, and it's quite a remarkable thing. He says it this way: consider well. Society is the standing wonder of our existence, a true region of the supernatural, as it were, a second all-embracing life, wherein our first individual life becomes doubly and triply alive, and whatever of infinitude was in us bodies itself forth and becomes visible and active. Now, this is an interesting argument. It's one that Jordan Peterson has made as well. We take for granted, at our own peril, I fear at times, we take for granted the fact that society works as well as it works. We have tendencies, when of course we're disgruntled with society and the woes of society, and rightfully so we should be disgruntled, to just pull the plug on the whole thing and burn it down. We have to remember that society functions for us as a tremendous aid, but it is an aid that we really don't think very much about. I mean, the fact that the lights are on, the plumbing works, and all of the things that society offers to us, and obviously the tradition as well of society, no question. One of my favorite passages from this essay has to do with silence. I'll just read it for you. It's remarkable prose. Let's just enjoy it. Well might the ancients make silence a god, for it's the element of all godhood, infinitude, or transcendental greatness. At once the source and the ocean wherein all such being begins and ends. In the same sense, too, have poets sung hymns to the night, as if night were nobler than day, as if day were but a small, motley-colored veil spread transiently over the infinite bosom of night, and did but deform and hide from us its purely transparent eternal deeps. So likewise have they spoken and sung as if silence were the grand epitome and complete sum total of all harmony, and death, what mortals call death, properly the beginning of life. Under such figures, since except in figures there is no speaking of the invisible, have men endeavored to express a great truth, a truth in our times as nearly as is perhaps possible, forgotten by the most, which nevertheless continues forever true, forever all important, and will one day, under new figures, be again brought home to the bosoms of all. And then he goes on to speak about the mystery that is a part of this silence. Critiquing society, he will begin to talk about the skepticism and the doubt that will be a part of this time that he is living in. A region of doubt, he says, therefore hovers forever in the background. In action alone can we have certainty. Now, of course, we're familiar with this idea, and he gained this idea in large measure from his study of Goethe's Faust. You can go and take a look at our comments on that text. The second text that I want to look at real briefly with you is his inaugural address. It's an interesting address on the 2nd of April, 1866. His wife, by the way, will die shortly thereafter, and critiquers, scholars will often say that Carlyle was never the same man. He was pretty much a broken man after he lost his wife. Although they had a very interesting relationship and was somewhat bellicose, still, once he lost her, he never seemed to recover very well. Now, this inaugural address is a classic statement of why we love ideas, and especially why we love to read. He'll begin very early in this address saying it this way. He says, Advices, he's talking to young students, I believe, to young men as to all men, are very seldom much valued. There is a great deal of advising and very little faithful performing, and talk that does not end in any kind of action is better suppressed altogether. I would not therefore go much into advising, but there is one advice I must give you. In fact, it's the summary of all advices, and doubtless you've heard it 1,000 times, but I must nevertheless let you hear it the 1,001st time. For it is most intensely true, whether you will believe it at present or not. Namely, that above all things, that interest of your whole life depends on your being diligent. Now, while it's called today, in this place where you have come to get education. Diligent. That includes in it all virtues that a student can have. I mean it to include all those qualities of conduct that lead on to the acquirement of real instruction and improvement in such a place. If you will believe me, you who are young, yours is the golden season of life. Well, I think that's an important bit of advice, right? The idea of what we call in 303 sustained will vis-a-vis energy conservation. About anything that you do, ask, do I really need to do this? About your studies, be diligent, and you will, of course, have some payoff. At least that's the suggestion. The second bit of advice that he gives in this famous address has to do with his views on honesty. He says it this way: gradually see what kind of work you individually can do. It is the first of all problems for a man to find out what kind of work he is to do in this universe. In short, morality as regards study is, as in all other things, the primary consideration and overrules all others. A dishonest man, he says, a dishonest man cannot do anything real. He never will study with real fruit, and perhaps it would be greatly better if he were tied up from trying it. He does nothing but darken counsel by the words he utters. And then he goes on to say, this is a very old doctrine, and yet one that he very much believes in. That quest to be authentic, to be truthful in one's speech, and obviously in one's studies. He will sound very much like Mortimer Adler, one of the great heroes of 303, when he makes an observation about good reading. He says it this way: well, gentlemen, whatever you may think of these historical poems that he's just made, the clearest and most imperative duty lies on every one of you to be assiduous in your reading. This sounding very much like Francis Bacon in his classic essay of studies. We've treated it at learnstrong.net. Assiduous, in other words, careful, right? Diligent. Learn to be good readers, which is perhaps a more difficult thing than you imagine. Learn to be discriminative in your reading, to read faithfully and with your best attention all kinds of things which you have a real interest in, a real, not an imaginary, and which you find to be really fit for what you are engaged in. I think this is an important observation. Obviously, we live in a time when we don't read as much as once we did, and yet I think that we can still profit from this observation in this regards. Learn to be a good reader, no doubt, but more importantly, learn to be a good thinker. That is to say, learn to be a good listener. And even if you're observing texts, watching film, whatever, or you're listening to text through audio and the like, whatever your access is to text and the ideas that are translated through those texts, learn to be a good student by paying close attention, right? And therefore, learn to be a good thinker. The final observation that I'll have Carlyle share with us comes at close to the end of his speech. And he talks about what is most important of all. What is it that's most important of all? He says, I'll tell you what it is. Reverence. Reverence. Honor done to those who are greater and better than ourselves. Honor distinct from fear. That is to say, reverence, the soul of all religion that has ever been among men or ever will be. And I think this is a good way for us to end our observations on Carlyle. As we've said many times in 303, we always are looking to show proper respect. We may not agree, Often we won't agree. We have said often, we are the stories that we tell, the stories we retell. We're the stories we accept, but we're also the stories we reject. But before we reject a story, we have to show it proper reverence, proper respect. That is to say, as a student, as a reader, as a thinker, we're always wanting to engage in proper dialogue, aren't we? With other ideas. They may be ideas we don't agree with. In fact, they often will be ideas that we don't agree with. And yet, we're going to pay proper respect, proper reverence. I think Carlyle here is giving us as students a very useful bit of advice. Well, I hope that you'll go on to maybe do a bit of reading of Thomas Carlyle. Thank you.